A leather-bound codex sits in a locked cabinet in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, shelf mark Bruce 74. It has not been read by the public in over 200 years. It is a Ge'ez manuscript of the complete Book of Enoch, and it contains the chapters that no Bible on earth prints. Church leaders removed Enoch from Scripture at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. Banned, hidden, called dangerous. For 17 centuries, that was the end of it. Then, in 1947, 11 separate copies surfaced in the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. More copies than Deuteronomy, more than Exodus, more than most books that stayed in the Bible. And when scholars finally translated the oldest fragments, they found what the councils had buried. Enoch does not describe visions. He describes places, a prison inside the earth, with a measured depth, a structure at the edge of the world with a door that has no handle. 200 beings named individually, by name, with their assignments recorded like a duty roster. Not a myth, not a metaphor. He names them. He gives the coordinates. He records the sentence and the term. In the next several minutes, you will see what the text actually says, where it points on a real map, and why direct access to the oldest manuscripts has been restricted since 1974. If forbidden biblical history fascinates you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from Scripture. But here's what makes this stranger. The darkest material is not scattered across the book. It is concentrated in the first 36 chapters, the section scholars call the Book of the Watchers. Fragment 4Q201, held at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, carries Aramaic text from those chapters. It has been carbon dated to roughly 200 BCE. That fragment is older than any surviving text in the New Testament, older than the Gospels by more than 2 centuries. The Ge'ez tradition preserved in Ethiopia carries the complete version, and Dr. Michael Knibb, whose 1978 Oxford translation remains the scholarly standard, noted that this section preserves a textual layer far older than the rest of the corpus. The oldest layer of Enoch is the part they cut hardest. And the reason becomes obvious the moment you read it. Chapter 6 does not open like Scripture. It opens like a personnel record. The text says 200 watchers descended and bound themselves by mutual oath on the summit of Mount Hermon. Then it does something apocalyptic literature never does. It lists the officers Semjaza, Armaros, Barakijal, Kokabil, Ezekiel, 19 names, each with a rank and a command of 10. Chapter 8 assigns each one a specialty. Azazel taught metalwork and weapons. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabil taught the constellations. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments. This is not symbolism. This is a technology transfer log with named instructors and subject assignments. The level of detail is wrong for ancient literature. Apocalyptic writing deals in beasts, horns, and numbers that mean something else. Enoch deals in names, ranks, oaths, coordinates, and depths. First person, past tense. He does not interpret. He records. He wasn't interpreting signs. He was documenting what he encountered. And this is where it gets disturbing. What we're looking at breaks into 3 parts: the judgment, the prison, and the door. Start with the judgment because it is the most specific sentence ever recorded in ancient literature. Chapter 10, verse 4 records the instruction given to Raphael: bind Azazel hand and foot. Cast him into the darkness. Make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudael. Place upon him rough and jagged rocks. Cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever. The surface reading is that this is poetic imagery for divine punishment. But read what is actually in the sentence: a named being, a named location, a method of restraint, a construction instruction, a covering material, and a term. Dudael is a place name, not a metaphor. Later rabbinic sources place it in the wilderness east of Jerusalem. He gives the site, but the text doesn't stop there. Chapter 10, verse 12 gives the sentence for the rest. Bind them for 70 generations beneath the hills of the earth until the day of their judgment. 70 generations. Not forever, not eternally. A number. Apocalyptic literature does not sentence beings to fixed numerical terms with a defined start date. Courts do. Not detained. Not awaiting trial. Sentenced. What follows in chapter 21 is stranger still. Enoch is taken to inspect the facility. Verse 1 says, "He came to a place where nothing was done." Verse 2 describes what he sees. 7 stars, bound together like great mountains burning in fire. Verse 3 records his question. He asks what sin they committed, and the angel Uriel answers in verse 6 that these are the stars which transgressed the commandment and are bound here until 10,000 years, the time of their sin, are consummated. 10,000 years. The text gives a term for one group and 70 generations for another. Different sentences, different terms, different classes of prisoner. That is not mythology. That is a docket. And then comes the part that shouldn't be possible. Chapter 21, verse 7 describes the second location. Enoch writes that he saw a horrible thing, a great fire there, which burnt and blazed, and the place was cleft as far as the abyss, being full of great descending columns of fire. He gives the measurement of neither their extent nor magnitude, and he could not see. Columns of fire descending into a cleft in the earth. He does not say a vision of fire. He says columns, vertical, falling, into a cleft that goes down as far as the abyss. He records that he could not measure it. Apocalyptic writers do not admit the limits of their instruments. Surveyors do. Then, verse 8, he records his own physiological response. Then, I said, how fearful is the place and how terrible to look upon. Fear, written in first person, past tense, by a man reporting what standing there did to his body. He wrote it down with the same matter-of-fact tone you'd use filing an incident report. Here's what the translators left out. The standard English editions, including R.H. Charles's 1906 translation that nearly everyone still quotes, render the beings of chapter 1 as the holy ones and the watchers interchangeably. Soft, devotional. But the Aramaic word preserved in the Qumran fragments is irin. The root means to be awake, to be wakeful. The surface translation is watcher. The literal reading is the one who does not sleep. That is not a title of honor. That is a job description. A watcher does not observe. A watcher is stationed. And a being that cannot sleep is not resting between assignments. It is on duty. Now, hold that against chapter 12, verse 4, where Enoch is sent to deliver the verdict. The text calls the condemned the watchers of heaven who have left the high heaven. Same word, iron. The ones who do not sleep. The text is applying a duty designation to prisoners. Charles rendered it as a poetic epithet. The Aramaic renders it as a status. Enoch doesn't explain the difference. The text moves on, but the implication sits there. Whatever is bound beneath the hills for 70 generations is not unconscious. It is awake. It has been awake the entire time. What modern readers don't realize is how closely this matches what geologists have found under the exact terrain Enoch names. In 2011, a joint survey by the Geological Survey of Israel and international partners mapped the subsurface of the Judean Desert and the Dead Sea Rift using seismic reflection and borehole data. What they documented is one of the most structurally violent zones on the planet. The Dead Sea Transform is an active tectonic boundary. The basin floor sits roughly 430 meters below sea level, the lowest exposed land on Earth. Beneath it, the sedimentary column descends more than 10 kilometers, and the Judean Desert is riddled with them. Sinkholes. Over 6,000 of them have opened along the Dead Sea shoreline since the 1980s, and the rate is accelerating. They form when subsurface salt layers dissolve and the ground above collapses into the void. Vertical shafts, opening in the desert. In the exact wilderness the text names as the site of the opening. The text says, "Make an opening in the desert," which is in Judea. The science found a desert that opens itself over and over into vertical shafts descending into a rift that goes down 10 kilometers. The parallel is not metaphorical, it is structural. And there is a second layer. The Judean rift is geothermally active. Hot springs along the western shore run above 40 degrees Celsius. The region vents gas. Enoch writes of a cleft as far as the abyss, full of descending columns of fire, in the same terrain that modern surveys describe as an active thermal rift over the deepest continental depression on Earth. He had no seismograph, no borehole, no way to know what sat 10 kilometers beneath his feet. The suppression starts at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. The council's own reasoning was that Enoch was not canonical and should not be read in churches. But the specific problem was never only doctrinal. Enoch names a site. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, listed Enoch among the Apocrypha and dismissed it as unworthy of study. Augustine, writing in the City of God around 410 CE, argued the book was too ancient to be trusted, and that its claims of antiquity were themselves grounds for suspicion. Neither addressed the specificity. Neither explained why a text that survived in 11 copies at Qumran was reciting names, ranks, and terms of imprisonment. The Ethiopian Church, operating independently of Rome, never removed it. Enoch remained canonical there without interruption, and it is canonical there today. Then, in 1773, the Scottish explorer James Bruce carried 3 Ge'ez manuscripts out of Ethiopia to Europe. One of them is the codex now sitting in the Bodleian. The reception was immediate hostility. When Richard Lawrence published the first English translation in 1821, critics dismissed the book as a late forgery, a Christian fabrication, a text with no ancient standing. That verdict held for over a century. Ron destroyed it in 1947. The Aramaic fragments proved Enoch was pre-Christian, pre-Roman, and older than the Gospels. The scholarly consensus had been wrong for 126 years. And even then, the fragments moved slowly. The Enoch material at Qumran was assigned to a single editor, Joseph Milik, and sat unpublished for decades. His edition did not appear until 1976, 29 years after the discovery. Now, here's where it gets active. Access to the oldest Ethiopian manuscript collections was restricted after 1974, when the revolution reclassified church holdings as national cultural property. The oldest Ge'ez codices in Ethiopia remain under church and state custody, and researchers have documented decades of difficulty obtaining direct examination. Then it got worse. In 2020 and 2021, armed conflict in the Tigray region put the oldest manuscript collections in the country inside a war zone. UNESCO and heritage organizations issued public warnings about the destruction and looting of Ethiopian church archives. Manuscripts that had survived 400 years in the same room were reported missing, burned, or unaccounted for. There is no complete public inventory of what was lost. The oldest surviving witnesses to Enoch's text may have burned in the last 5 years, and nobody can say for certain which ones. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying there is a numbered cell beneath the Judean desert with a named prisoner inside serving a fixed term. The Book of Enoch is not a corrections department intake form, but what the text describes, when you read it carefully, matches the documented record with a precision that ancient literature does not produce by accident. He names a desert. The desert is real. He describes an opening made in that desert. That desert opens itself into vertical shafts by the thousand. He describes a cleft descending toward an abyss. The rift beneath it descends 10 kilometers. He describes columns of fire in an active thermal zone. The zone is thermally active. He assigns fixed numerical terms to different classes of prisoner. He records his own fear standing at the edge, and admits he could not measure the depth. He had no instruments. He had no way to see beneath the ground. He should not describe an opening in the desert, a cleft to the abyss, and columns of fire in the one place on earth, where all three are literally true. And yet the text sits there, in Ge'ez and Aramaic, in fragments found at Qumran, saying what it has said for over 2,000 years. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If the text is older than the Gospels, if it survived in more copies at Qumran than Deuteronomy, if it names 200 beings with ranks and assignments instead of symbols, if it hands down fixed sentences with numbered terms, and if it places all of it in a real desert that really does open into shafts above a rift 10 kilometers deep, then the text is not mythology. It is documentation. Enoch went somewhere, he saw something, he wrote it down with the same matter-of-fact tone you'd use writing a property deed. The place he describes, the opening in the desert, the jagged rocks, the cleft to the abyss, the beings who do not sleep, is either a symbol we have misread for 2 millennia, or it is exactly what he says it is. The codex sits in a cabinet in Oxford, shelf mark Bruce 74. Fragment 4Q 201 sits under glass in Jerusalem. The oldest Ge'ez witnesses sit behind church walls in Ethiopia, in a region that was a war zone 5 years ago, with no public inventory of what survived. The desert is still there, still opening into shafts, above a rift no one has reached the bottom of. The names are still written, the terms are still running, and the ones who do not sleep are still awake, exactly the way Enoch said they would be. The next investigation is on screen now. Every week, we open what was removed from the record.